Inflation is supposedly back under control, but grocery prices in Canada are still roughly 22% higher than they were just a few years ago. And even in June 2026, grocery prices were still rising faster than overall inflation. So if inflation came down, why didn't your grocery bill? The answer isn't just inflation, and it isn't just Loblaw either, because the price you're paying today may have started changing months before that food ever reached the shelf. To understand why groceries stayed so expensive, we need to follow your money backwards. And the first thing to understand is something surprisingly easy to get wrong. Lower inflation does not mean lower prices. Imagine your grocery bill starts at $100. Prices rise 8%. Now you're paying $108. Later, inflation falls all the way to 2%. That doesn't take your bill back to $100. It means that $108 keeps getting more expensive, just more slowly. Lower inflation slows the elevator. It doesn't bring it back down. And that's exactly what happened after Canada's inflation shock. The massive increases Canadians experienced over the last few years mostly became part of the new price level. So when inflation cooled, those increases weren't erased. And that explains part of your grocery bill, but not all of it. Because food has often been getting more expensive faster than many other things Canadians buy. And food is different for one major reason. Your grocery store is only the final stop in a much bigger system. Take coffee. Canada doesn't grow the coffee beans sitting on supermarket shelves. So when bad weather hits producers overseas, global coffee prices rise, or the Canadian dollar weakens, that shock can eventually travel all the way into your grocery cart. Same coffee, same bag, higher Canadian cost. And recently, those international pressures mattered a lot. The Bank of Canada found that the resurgence in food inflation during 2025 was driven largely by rising import costs, especially imported processed foods. One reason was the Canadian dollar. When the Canadian dollar loses value, Canadian importers need more dollars to purchase the exact same product priced in a foreign currency. And some foods were hit much harder than average. By December 2025, coffee prices were about 31% higher than a year earlier. Chocolate and confectionery products were around 14% higher. Beef was around 17% higher. But here's what's important. Those products didn't all become more expensive for the same reason. Coffee and chocolate were hit by global supply shortages, extreme weather, and trade pressures. Beef faced its own pressures, including drought, feed costs, and cattle supply. That's why there isn't one single explanation for grocery inflation. A steak, a chocolate bar, and a bag of coffee can sit beside each other in the same supermarket, while arriving there through completely different economic systems. But here's where this gets even more interesting. Those cost shocks don't reach your grocery bill immediately. Bank of Canada research found that it can take roughly 6 to 9 months for changes in food production costs to be fully reflected in grocery prices. 6 to 9 months. A cost shock in January can still be working its way into your grocery bill in September. Grocers use long-term contracts. They hold inventory purchased at older prices. Suppliers negotiate new prices. And companies often wait to see whether a cost increase is temporary or permanent. So the price you're complaining about today may actually be reacting to something that happened half a year ago. But that creates an uncomfortable question. If higher costs take months to reach the shelf on the way up, what happens when those costs start coming back down? Do grocery prices fall just as quickly? Not necessarily. Old inventory still exists. Contracts are still in place. Other costs may not have fallen. And then one other factor becomes extremely important: competition. Which brings us to Loblaw, Sobeys, Metro, and the structure of Canada's grocery industry. Canada's grocery market is dominated by a relatively small number of very large companies. A concentrated market doesn't mean grocery chains can simply charge anything they want. But competition still matters, because when businesses are fighting aggressively for customers, they have stronger incentives to cut prices, offer promotions, accept lower margins, and find ways to become cheaper than the store across the street. When there are fewer serious competitors, some of that pressure can be weaker, and Canada's Competition Bureau has been unusually direct about this. After studying the industry, it concluded that Canada needs more grocery competition. The Bureau also estimated that just a 1 percentage point increase in grocery store gross margins could add more than $1 billion to Canadians' food bills every year. 1 percentage point. That's how enormous this market is. But there's an even stranger part of the competition problem. Real estate. Sometimes a competitor can face barriers before it even gets the chance to open a store. The Competition Bureau has been investigating what are called competitor property controls. These are restrictions attached to commercial real estate that can limit how certain properties are used, including in ways that may make it harder for another grocery store to open nearby. Think about that. Competition over the price of your groceries can begin before there is even food on the shelves. It can begin with who is allowed to open across the parking lot. That doesn't mean property controls determine the price of your milk, but it shows how grocery competition can be shaped by much more than the number of logos you see while driving through your neighborhood. And in 2026, the issue is still active. Canada's Competition Bureau launched another examination of the food supply chain, looking for places where greater competition could improve outcomes from production all the way to the consumer. But this brings us to the question almost everyone asks. If Canada's grocery companies make billions of dollars, aren't their profits the obvious reason food costs so much? Not exactly, because one number gets misunderstood constantly: gross margin. Imagine a grocery store sells $100 worth of products. If those products cost the retailer $70 to buy, $30 remains. That's gross margin. But the retailer does not simply pocket that $30. It still has to pay for employees, stores, logistics, electricity, administration, and other operating expenses. What's left after those costs is much closer to actual profit. So a 30% gross margin does not mean a grocer keeps $30 of profit from every $100 you spend. But margins still matter. Because when millions of Canadians buy groceries every single week, even a small change in the spread between wholesale costs and retail prices can become enormous. Statistics Canada reported that its index measuring grocery store markups was up 11.2% year over year in May 2026. That does not mean grocery companies suddenly made 11.2% more profit. It measures changes in the difference between the average price grocery stores pay for products and the average price at which they sell them. And that's an important distinction, because if you try to follow the extra money in your grocery bill, there isn't one person standing behind the supermarket taking all of it. Some of the increase can begin with farmers and producers, some with imported ingredients, some with processing, packaging, transportation, labor, retail operations, and yes, some ultimately becomes profit. But the mix is different for almost everything you buy. Imported olive oil doesn't have the same cost structure as Canadian milk. Coffee doesn't behave like beef. Fresh vegetables don't behave like packaged cereal. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Why are groceries still so expensive in Canada? Because the inflation shock raised the entire starting point. When inflation came down, those earlier price increases weren't erased. They simply started growing more slowly. Then new pressures kept arriving through imports, commodities, weather, currency movements, and other parts of the supply chain. And because those costs can take months to reach store shelves, today's grocery bill can reflect economic problems that started long before today's shopping trip. On top of all of that sits a grocery market where Canada's own competition regulator says more competition is needed. Costs help explain why prices rise. Competition helps determine how much pressure businesses face to bring prices back down when they can. And that's the uncomfortable answer. Canadians may be waiting for grocery prices to go back to normal, but the old normal may already be gone. Lower inflation doesn't erase the inflation that already happened. So the real question isn't when your grocery bill returns to 2021. It's what happens from this new, much higher starting point. Because groceries aren't the only Canadian expense where prices exploded, inflation cooled. And somehow the bill never really felt normal again.